Okay, welcome everybody. Dr. Stephen Patterson is a renowned expert on the origins of Christianity, the author of several books and dozens of scholarly articles. Dr. Patterson has lectured around the world and appeared in many documentaries. In other words, a scholarly thinker. Willamette is lucky to have him, and today we are lucky to have him. Please welcome Dr. Patterson.
Good morning, or good afternoon, excuse me. It's been kind of a hectic day, but I'm glad to be with you. My sister is visiting us for a week, and she came in last night about 1 o'clock in the morning, PDX. So I went to bed about 3 and lectured, and I did class all morning. So if I'm catching my breath a little bit, that's why. I'm also a little uneasy. Let's go ahead and change the projection. I'm interested in Anthony Hopkins' words, of course. I'm also a little uneasy today because, as David said, and thank you, Dave, for that nice, kind introduction, I'm a historian of early Christianity. My speaking and writing seldom go beyond the 2nd century. But as you are aware, there's something going on in our culture right now, and I'm concerned about it. I'm sure that many of you are also concerned about it. And I think that because of that, it's incumbent upon those of us who are asked to think for a living and teach to try and figure out what it is that is happening in our culture, in our country, and to, if not explain it, to shed some light on it. It is a complicated thing, and economists will weigh in, and political historians will weigh in. But I think that one of the blind spots that we have in trying to understand ourselves and our culture, and maybe because we are historically and constitutionally a secular nation, we have a big religious blind spot. We don't realize when religion is impacting our lives. And it does whether or not you are religious or not. And so as a historian of religion, I think it's my responsibility to at least sometimes wander outside of my comfort zone and look not at the 1st century or the 2nd century, but maybe the 21st century, and that's what I'm doing today. So I'm a little uneasy, I'm a little out of my depth, but I've been to this group many, many times, and I know you are a friendly bunch and open to lots of new ideas. So I'm not nervous per se, I'm just a little bit out of my depth. I advertised this to Dave and the curriculum committee as Christian Nationalism and America's Religious DNA. As I worked on it, though, I thought I might better have called it authoritarianism. Let's move. Oh yeah, here we go. I'll get used to it here. Okay, I'm going to do this here and this here. Okay, authoritarianism and America's religious DNA, because I think it's a more general problem. The question of authoritarianism in Western civilization comes up again and again and again. It's important for us to understand it. In its present iteration among us, it has a strong religious element. It's right there on the front page. It's front and center. A good piece of the authoritarian movement in America today has anointed its leader, Mr. Trump, with a kind of Christ-like status, a messianic status. And it's important for us to understand how that can be and why it is. And so that's why I'm here today, to share my half-baked thoughts with you all. And Lord knows who might be tuning into CTV to hear these things also. So on we go, on we go. Let's begin at the beginning. A clean slate. When the revolution, the American Revolution, was over, America had a kind of clean slate with respect to polity. But most people don't realize, I think, that it had a kind of clean slate with respect to religion as well. This is because the dominant religious denominations in the colonies were the Church of England, and then more recently the Methodist Church, the Wesleyan churches, which had sprung up and spread rapidly after something called the First Great Awakening, and were probably the largest denomination second to the Church of England. During the Revolution, all the Church of England leaders, all the priests, more or less all decamped back to England. And so did the Wesleyans. And so those two traditions were left pretty much leaderless. And the Presbyterians had a presence, but they were very weak presence at the time. The Congregationalists had been in decline for several decades at the time, and so the colonies weren't terribly religious at the time of the Revolution anyway. It was a kind of an unchurched period, and so and a lot of churches were destroyed during the war. So, just in terms of infrastructure and leadership, the churches were dead in the water after the Revolution. And this was true for about a decade. Then Americans began to move. They poured across the Appalachians and the Alleghenies and through the Cumberland Gap into what they referred to as the Southwest Territories, which was Kentucky and Tennessee, parts of West Virginia, and the Northwest Territories, which we today call Ohio, of course. And they made their way into these territories that were inhabited by local tribes, and they began to make their way. My own history, my family history, is part of this. My great six greats grandfather fought in the Revolution, and was given a land grant in Ohio in reward for his service. And so after the war, he came across the Cumberland Gap like thousands and thousands of others to claim his piece of ground. And when he got there, he discovered that somebody already had it. And I don't know what happened then. He probably got his butt kicked and moved on. Because he moved on, he went on to the Louisiana Territory, to French North America, and crossed the river into St. Louis and settled there. So that story is like thousands of other stories. It's a story of questing hope, but encountering other things, failure. Freedom is about lack of restraint, and restraint was weak in those places. But freedom is also about agency, being able to do things, and agency was weak too. And so many people failed. They didn't succeed. More people probably starved than thrived. And other things were happening. They were bringing enslaved peoples into those territories. Andrew Jackson made his fortune by driving slaves through the Cumberland Gap into the old Southwest Territory of Kentucky. Many people did that. They also encountered the native tribes. This was the time, the so-called Creek War, which was a war of extermination against the Creek Nation. Eventually then the Cherokees came under fire and they were exterminated and or moved. What I'm saying is a lot of bad things were happening in this period, and people were doing bad things. I asked my students to imagine this time and what it might have been like, and they said, well, people would have been afraid. I think that's true. People would have been bored, they said. I mean, well, clearing land is, it's boring work. It's hard work, punctuated by adrenaline when you were attacked by a robber or a tribe. And they said, well, they were horny too. I said, well, okay, that's probably true. A lot of people went singly into those territories, and there they were. And so, this is to say, it's a lot of chaos. This is a very chaotic and violent time in American history, and a lot of the chaos and violence was taking place in these areas: Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. So let's hold on for that just a moment. I had a plan today, and I forgot about executing it. And the plan is that I'm going to give you index cards. And maybe, Dave, if you could help. Yeah, we'll just, so that I'm going to go on for about an hour, and then we're going to take a break. And then after the hour, I'm not going to deliver any more formal remarks or even informal ones like I'm doing now. But I want to ask you to join in conversation with me, and we're going to do that with these index cards. A lot of people don't like to stand up in front of a crowd and pose a question. So what I'm going to ask you to do is put questions you might have or comments on an index card, if you can dig up something to write with. And then during the break, I'll take a look at them and kind of organize them, and they always fall into, sort of groups and themes, and so we'll use that to structure our conversation in the second half of the afternoon. Does it sound good? Okay, so index cards are coming around. Now back to work. So, in the middle of this very chaotic, very violent time on the American frontier, this picture looks nice, doesn't it? It looks very inviting. I should have chosen a different picture, filled with carnage or something. But this is the way it's usually imagined, isn't it? The great American West, westering into beautiful territory, unclaimed land. Well, that's baloney. We know that's baloney. It was very hard, and it wasn't unclaimed land. They were invading, and they were pushing by force other people out. So, when all this is happening, something surprising happens out in these wild lands. Rough and ready preachers, leftovers who didn't decamp back to England, that is the untrained and the lay preachers and whatnot, they began to hold forth out here in this wilderness, and some of them were pretty good at it. And in 1797, excuse me, 1797, the whole thing sort of blew up. People heard that these interesting meetings were going on. They were bored, probably looking for a good time. And they went and they heard dynamic preaching, people telling them what they already knew, that your you're violent, you're unkempt, you're out of control, you're full of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you're horny, you're doing things you ought not to do, engaged in violence. And look at this. Look at it. It's a mess. Our country is a mess. And it's not going to be any better until you straighten up your lives and repent. Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, got swept up in this movement we call the Great Awakening. Call it the Second Great Awakening here, second in parentheses, because there was a First Great Awakening in the 18th century, about 50 years before, and some people really dispute whether or not it was really worthy of the name of the Great Awakening, so they just call this the Great Awakening. It's kind of confusing. So anyway, this is the one. This is the one that became a mass movement. And these meetings were, I suppose you could only describe them as mass hysteria. People were fainting. People were speaking in tongues. People were getting what they called the leaps, jumping up and down, or the jerks when their bodies would go into spasm. They were singing and dancing wildly, dancing with people they didn't know, sneaking off into the bushes, I think, too. All kinds of wild, ecstatic religious experience. Really almost unprecedented in, well, certainly in the history of religion as I know it. I don't know of anything else really comparable, certainly not in American history, but I think really in the history of religion it's quite a rare thing, where thousands and thousands of people would be caught up in this kind of ecstatic, mass hysteria, religious movement. It's been called the most significant religious event in American history, one of the most significant cultural events for shaping America and its culture. And from it was born, well, I'm going to say, from it was born America's religious DNA. The groups involved were these familiar characters. You know them today as the mainline denominations. But understand, these were not the denominations you know today. These are not the Presbyterians across the street in the frozen chosen, we call them, yes? These were wild evangelical Presbyterians. Disciples. There's a disciples church on the other corner over here in downtown. They're not so frozen, but they're not dancing around in the aisles either. The Methodists down the street here. The Methodists used to speak in tongues. These don't. Baptists. Well, Baptists are, you can still find a wild Baptist around. Episcopalians were caught up in this, the remnants of the Church of England that reorganized itself after the Revolution. And even the old Congregationalists. The Great Awakening spread throughout the Southwest and the Northwest, but then back over the mountains into upstate New York. One of the most famous preachers of the Second Great Awakening was Charles Finney, a more sedate version of all this, but the same basic message. You are sinners, and the world's going to hell in a handbasket because of it. And if you want this to be a great nation, you have to straighten out and fly right. This is Calvinism. The Second Great Awakening, as the First Great Awakening, was a Calvinist movement. It's kind of an odd kind of Calvinism. It's not original Calvinism. It's a kind of Calvinism that I'll call American Calvinism. You might more properly call it Arminian Calvinism. If you know a little bit about church history, you know Calvin, John Calvin, the European reformer, second after Luther began the Reformation. Calvin comes in and begins the second wave of the Reformation. And Calvin's focus was on sin, and especially original sin. The idea that everyone, all of you, are sinful because you're made that way. Well, you weren't originally made that way, but Adam made you that way. Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, fell from grace, and because of that, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Calvin took that to the nth degree and argued, really following Augustine, that you really can't help it. And so salvation comes only as an act of grace from God. God chooses to save people from this sinful state in which we are born. And that is in God's head. Who is saved and who is not saved is all up there in God's noggin. And if you're not saved, you're not saved. And if you are, you are. It's got nothing to do with who you are or what you do. It's just up there in God's head. Certain people are predestined and certain people are not. Arminius said, that's not a very good idea. Because for one thing, there's a lot of moral hazard in it. If you can't do anything to respond to God's offer of grace, and it doesn't matter, you're predestined to salvation. Why don't you just live a profligate life and see what happens when you die? And so Arminius said, human beings do have the capacity to accept grace, accept salvation, and respond. And so there's an element of agency now in this kind of Calvinism. It's not just all predestination. You're sinful. It's bad. But when the offer of grace comes, you are able to respond to it. Now, Arminius kept in the back of his head a little idea, but God knows who's going to respond and who's not going to respond. Well, okay, fine. But you still have to respond. And so that's what happens. That's the kind of religion that was preached during the Second Great Awakening. That kind of American Arminian Calvinism. It's got these elements. The idea that there are chosen people. There is a chosen people. We are a chosen people. Remember, Calvin was famous for, of course, settling in Geneva and helping to remake Geneva, Switzerland, into a kind of a church-ordered community, a biblically ordered community of chosen people living according to a divine plan. And so this kind of Calvinism we're talking about begins with the idea that we are a chosen people. Oops. Okay, excuse me. It includes the idea from Calvinism of original sin. Sin is the problem that needs to be addressed. And you can imagine out there on the frontier, that was the problem that people were struggling with in their lives. All the bad things they were doing or having to do, and not necessarily the bad things they were doing, but also just the failure, the futility of that many of them must have experienced in trying to carve a new life in a land that they were ill-suited to. That is, we say the wilderness, but it wasn't a wilderness to everybody. It was just a wilderness to Europeans who weren't used to surviving in places like that. This American Calvinism has a lot of emotion to it. And why this is anybody's guess, but the Second Great Awakening was primarily an emotional event. It was an emotional religious movement. Maybe you can imagine maybe there's an element of catharsis here. Perhaps there's a psychologist in the room that could help us get our arms around this aspect of it. But it was a very emotional thing. And if you compare American religion, American Protestantism especially, but American religion in general, with what you encounter in Europe, this stands out. In Europe, you don't have people giving their lives to Christ in these great emotional conversion experiences. You just don't. That's kind of unique to us. It's part of our religious DNA. But after the emotion is finished, after the big cathartic jumping around and barking like dogs and twitches or whatever else happened to you in the course of the camp meeting. There's a moment of submission. That's the point. You submit. You submit. You give your life to Christ. You give your life to, dedicate your life to the Lord. This act of submission, going from experience of wild freedom, I'm out here, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want, to boom, submission. That's important. That's a big part of it. And I think that's a big element in all authoritarian systems, so I'm calling attention to it now, that this part of American Calvinism, emotion, catharsis followed by submission, is a big, big element in authoritarianism and how it works and how it functions. I'll return to that later. This religious movement was strongly millenarian. That is, they believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent. And so the impetus for getting your life straight, of giving your life to Christ and submitting to the authority. It's not, you're submitting to Christ, but what you're really submitting to is the society around you, the divinely ordered community that you all are going to become, right? And so it's not just submission to an abstract mythological figure, Christ. It's submitting to the preacher who's talking to you. It's submitting to the community in which you live. It's agreeing to live a sedate life. Why? Because the Lord is coming. And that means that there's going to be a reckoning, and it's going to be soon. And so the last two things I would call attention to are, hold on a second. I told you I'm kind of shaky with this lecture today. Conformity and reform. Now, but before I go there, I want to go back and I want to talk just a moment about how all of this relates to the new American experience, radical experience of freedom. Right? I think it's important for me anyway, it's important to understand how this Calvinism responds to the experience of freedom. So freedom, as you know, is both a gift and a burden. Freedom is both freedom from restraints, freedom from the church, freedom from the king, freedom from your parents. Freedom is freedom from restraint, and we all love that. Everybody wants that. But freedom is also freedom to. Freedom to. And that's more of a challenge. To have agency, to risk failure, to take responsibility. Freedom to is a lot more challenging than freedom from. And when people encounter the challenges and the experience of freedom to, that's when doubts form. Said the American frontier was weak in restraint, but it was a challenge, a big challenge to normal human agency. Financial failure, moral failure, violence, fear, uncertainty, all these things characterize the American experience of freedom. In colonial America, and in Europe, for 14 centuries before, the combination of the crown and the mitre, the king and the bishop, had created a kind of structure into which everyone could find a place, could fit, and know your place, your function in life, what you're supposed to do, and maybe most importantly, your fate, your prospects. In the United States of freedom, the crown was gone. That was the point, right? No more king. And so, we're free. That gives people an enormous sense of freedom, But freedom is not just a political fact. It's also a psychological state, right? And people need more than permission to be free. They need a mindset of freedom, right? And that was lacking in the colonies. That was always given by, in a certain sense, by the church. And in the absence of the church, where was it going to come from? The Constitution filled the void left by the crown. What would fill the void left by the mitre? Well, it was American Calvinism. And now the constraint is no longer top down. It's not a kind of strongly hierarchical form, but the restraint comes from within. It's you realizing that you need some controls here. You need to pump the brakes. You need to submit. Nobody's going to make you submit. But you need to submit to some higher authority, and that's what American Calvinism offers. Am I making sense here? Is this coming through at all? Or am I just babbling along here? I hope this is making some kind of sense to you. Okay, all right. Like I say, I'm several centuries out of my depth here, and if there's an American historian in the crowd, I tremble in fear for what you will say. But I think this is part of our history that we need to pay attention to. I've read a lot of historians on the 19th century in the last several months, and I have to say, religion is a blind spot for many of them. For many of them. So let's see. So out of the Second Great Awakening, then come these two great impulses. One is to conform. And these folks leaned into the ideal life that they believed they had derived from the Bible. So like all Protestantism, this is a biblically based religious system. But it wasn't all, it was a certain reading of the Bible. It was a reading of the Bible that said, well, get to work. Be industrialists. European Calvinism was very industrious. This is what Weber talked about as the birth of the Protestant work ethic. It comes from Calvinism. It comes from Geneva. It comes from Calvin. Follow the Ten Commandments. Live your life according to a certain set of rules. By the way, sex is bad. You get that from Genesis. Certain reading of Genesis that's passed down from Augustine through Calvin. Families are good as long as they're ordered in the correct manner. The father is the pater familias, and then beneath him in authority the wife and mother, and beneath her the children, the respectful children who say yes sir and yes, ma'am. And also the slaves. Last of all, the slaves. Let us not forget about the slaves. That too follows a biblical model. The New Testament explicitly endorses slavery and commands slaves to be obedient to their masters. We find this in the Deutero-Pauline epistles. Now I can put on my New Testament hat for a moment here and talk about the forged letters of Paul, but it doesn't really matter. It's in the Bible, and that's where it's coming from in this. All of this, of course, is to prepare for the second coming. So there's a second piece. There's a second piece. If the Lord is to come, then we have to make the world ready for him. We have to prepare it, and that is, you have to change society to make it more Christian. This begins the age of Christian crusading in America. All the crusades you can think of for temperance, for literacy, for urban poverty. The progressive era, which would be sort of a little bit later in the 19th century, the last decades of the 19th century, is born of this impulse from the Second Great Awakening to reform the world, to make it in the image of whatever you have in your head is the Christian way of life. The Christian way of life. Oh, but there was a problem. What does the Christian way of life have to do with slavery? First half of the 19th century was the time when Americans began to struggle and really work out the implications of slavery. Would this nation be a nation of slave holders? Would it be a slave society? Or would it not? Would it join the rest of the civilized world and put slavery away? I heard a very interesting lecture here last night over in Paulus Hall. The Frost lecture last night was about this and underscored again for us how much our idea that slavery was a little problem in the southern states and the United States was a free nation, but we had this little problem with slavery in the southern states we had to take care of through a little war. But that's not true, is it? Before the Civil War, the United States was a slave economy. All parts of the United States were involved in the slave economy, and every white American benefited from the slave economy. And so, what are we going to say about that as Christians? Well, many believed that slavery was biblical, and that a biblically oriented society included slavery, and that's, you're supposed to treat your slaves kindly and humanely, but slavery is slavery. Many others believed that slavery was an evil to be eradicated, the worst of all evils, and could not believe that their Christian brothers and sisters could countenance it. And they believed that it needed to be eradicated before the Lord could return. This is all in a millenarian environment, right? The Lord is coming. And so we have to order ourselves in a way that is acceptable to the Lord. Does that include slavery, or does that not include slavery? Well, I think we have to pause here again and talk about slavery and freedom, just as we talked a moment ago about religion and freedom. How did slavery function in the American experience of freedom? When the United States declared itself a free nation, it retained a piece of authoritarianism. America was never really a free nation until very recently, I would say, because it was a hybrid nation. It had a regime of freedom for people of European descent. It had a regime of authoritarianism for people of African descent, which were kidnapped and brought here to work in fields and factories and kitchens everywhere. In the 19th century, American politicians spoke of the benefits of slavery not just for planters, but for white yeoman farmers and factory workers as well. Though those workers had little agency and a very limited experience of freedom, therefore, still, they could still understand themselves as free by comparison to those around them who were enslaved. Remember, freedom is not just a political reality, it has to be a psychological reality as well. And people in this period in Jacksonian America, people in power worried aloud about this all the time. If slavery is eliminated, how will poor whites know they are free? And if they don't know they are free, if they wake up one day and say, we are too limited, they will rebel. A lot of people talk, the steam engine was a new invention in this period, right? And so a lot of people talked in terms of a safety valve or a release valve. And slavery was a release valve for poor whites. It went hand in hand, too, by the way, with westering and going into these new territories, because they also thought of land as a kind of safety valve. These people who didn't have land could go out and get their own land in the great Northwest, Ohio. But in fact, of course, it was a lot harder than they thought. For many religious conformers, poverty and submission could still feel like freedom if they lived in a social structure that included slaves. Would submission still feel like freedom if that were not the case? They worried a lot about that. They wondered about that. That's how slavery functioned in the American experience of freedom. Of course, after slavery was abolished, Americans still used the legacy of freedom in that way. Jim Crow and the whole creation of a caste society based on black and white skin color, so perceived, was the basis of the American experience of freedom for, well, is it still with us? Isabel Wilkerson, whose brilliant book, Caste, describes this wonderfully, precisely, would say, that is still with us. We better come back to that in just a moment. But for now, to understand that slavery wasn't just an economic question. It was a part of America's experience of freedom and their debate about freedom. How could people understand themselves to be free? All these churches we just noticed on the board a moment ago, all these churches that blew up in the Second Great Awakening, and by the end of the Second Great Awakening, more than 70% of the population belonged to one of these churches. They became very, very dominant. Those churches, every single one of the Presbyterians, the Disciples, the Baptists, the Anglicans, they all split down the middle over slavery in the 1850s. In 1861, they went to war. The Civil War was a religious war, I'm here to tell you. It will be described, it has been described, and quite rightly so, as an economic war, as an ideological war. But if you look at the rhetoric, if you look at the time, the way people spoke about their involvement in the war and their commitment to the war, it was religious. And people north and south were encouraged in their war making in the only place where people gathered regularly on a weekly basis to listen to somebody speak, namely their churches. That's where the motivation for the war and the meaning of the war took shape in the middle of the 19th century. It was very much a religious war. The Confederacy declared itself to be a Christian nation. And they cast themselves as the Christian nation, pitted against the godless North, which had a constitution that did not recognize God, did not even mention God. If there's any debate about whether or not the America was founded as a Christian nation, just ask any Confederate preacher in the heat of the battle, in the heat of the war, and they will tell you, no, the United States of America is a secular nation, and that's the problem. They're a godless, secular nation. In the North, of course, Northerners weren't going to take that sitting down, and so they were, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He has trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. They were singing their own songs, religious songs, marching us to war. And they could not believe how Christians could claim something so evil as slavery to be part of God's plan. Does this sound familiar to you at all? Mm-hmm. I was talking with students this morning, and they were saying, well, look, right now, we have a whole Christian cohort, a large part of American society, lining up behind Donald Trump, who, for whatever else you might say about him, is no Christian. He's hardly a paradigm of moral rectitude, and yet they have elevated him to a Christ-like status, right? And you have another big part of American society looking at that and say, how can you possibly think this about that man? It's an abomination to basic Christian morality to think this. These patterns of thinking are present in the 19th century with the Civil War. Absolutely. Absolutely. If the Constitution created a secular state, the Civil War created a religious society. Both sides saw themselves as engaged in a great battle to defend the will of God and to defeat the enemies of God on the other side. Remember Abraham Lincoln's famous second inaugural recognized that element. Even Lincoln, the non-believing president, the closest thing we've ever had to an atheist president, becomes a theologian in the Civil War. He does. And he speaks of the purpose of the war in explicit Christian terms. It is an atonement for the sins of slavery that the whole nation bears, he says. And the war will not end, he says. Remember the second inaugural. The war will not end until God decides that a sufficient amount of blood has been shed to atone for the sins of slavery. America's religious DNA was formed in the Second Great Awakening. It becomes part of America's cultural DNA in the Civil War. I'll stand by that. I think that's right. Even though I'm not a Civil War historian, I'm going to stand by that. Now, after the war, the nation reconciled. But the churches never did. Those churches, the Presbyterian Church, for example, remained divided north and south until the 1970s, maybe 1981. The Baptist churches never did reconcile. There's still a Northern Baptist Church and a Southern Baptist Church. And they have been divided all these years, more than a century now, over the issue of race. The Anglicans did reconcile, but they were rare. The Methodists never did. The Methodists later reconciled in the 20th century, but now are breaking up again over another issue of inclusion and discrimination. Anyway, in the North, these Great Awakening churches became progressive churches. Challenging the Bible on the issue of slavery kind of opened the door for challenging the Bible on all kinds of things, including patriarchy. So suffrage was a big cause of these churches. Poverty became a big cause. War. These churches were the anti-war churches during the Vietnam era. So they became more and more progressive over time. I was raised in these churches. This is kind of my own history from the 1960s on. I was born in 1957. When I first became aware of churches, that my father was a minister, and so the church we went to was a liberal Protestant church, and I thought that's what churches were. I just thought that was what American Christianity was, but I've learned that that's not true. That identity came over a long period of time in the 20th century as those churches challenged the Bible on science, for example. These are the churches that embraced science and provided witnesses in the Scopes trial on behalf of John Scopes and evolution. The Southern churches, but this legacy is also part of the religious DNA of America. This reforming impulse in liberal Protestant churches. We call them mainline churches today because they, we'll come back to that in a moment. Yes, here we go. We call them mainline churches today because they thrived for about a century, peaked in probably the 1960s, although they peaked in numbers in the early 1980s. If you go down to the Methodist Church here in about 1980, you would have seen 2 services probably, both of them quite full. The Presbyterians too would have been full up in the 1970s, certainly. Yeah, we call them the mainline churches because they were the dominant churches. They were the biggest church, the most successful churches, the most culturally prominent churches. And think of the things they championed. Civil rights, for example. Who keeps track of civil rights now? The federal government. Right? Who ensures that women have the right to vote now? The federal government. Yeah. So a lot of what mainline churches were doing and fighting for through all these progressive reforms were gradually adopted as mainstream cultural positions and became the province then of the federal government. And I don't know if this is true or not, but certainly since the 1980s, these churches have all been in radical decline, steep decline. Unfortunately, if you go to any of these big churches today, they're far too big to accommodate to accommodate the 25 or 30 folks who come on a Sunday morning to worship. Yeah. This is a sad story. I have to live with myself every day. I taught in a seminary for the United Church of Christ for about 20 years, and all that time we're just struggling, seeing the mainline churches decline. Maybe it was because they were too successful. Yeah. On the other hand, the churches, the southern churches, the churches that lean more heavily into the conforming impulse of the Great Awakening, they embraced a more patriotic version of Christianity. I was going to talk a little bit about this, but I didn't really know too much about it. But I think that I'm learning that the Spanish-American War played a big role in this. Apparently, it was the Spanish-American War, fought at the turn of the century, that brought the North and South politically back together, and specifically brought those fighting men back together in one fighting force. And the old ideas of America as a Christian nation take root in a broad swath of military people sort of bleeding over from the South. Yeah. And so those churches become much more patriotic, much more conforming. But they lose the battles that they were fighting over women's rights and civil rights. But as the mainline churches began to fail, these churches spread. And they spread into the northern states as well. Now these kind of evangelical churches are everywhere. In fact, some of them are the largest churches in America. I don't want to mislead you. By number, it's not that they're all that bigger than the main lines right now. They've also been declining. But they have a very prominent place in the American religious landscape because of the huge mega churches that they have built. But the theology is the same. That old Jeremiah sermon from the Great Awakening. You and you are sinners, and they out there, they are especially sinners. And for that reason, the world has gone to hell in a handbasket. And so, get your life together, submit to the Lord, give your life to Christ, which means straighten up and fly right, live according to the biblically mandated way of life that we will lay out for you. They have the same, very, very same structure. They're much closer to America's original DNA, religious DNA, than the mainline churches are. Much closer. I had to learn this. This was hard for me to learn, having grown up in mainline churches, but they really are much more American. Now, I don't want to say all of those churches are like this, but certainly within them, we have to face this. Within those churches, there remained a strong element of racialized Christian nationalism. And that element bubbled to the surface again and again through the 20th century. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan paraded down the Pennsylvania Avenue in force. And these hooded Klansmen are not masked. Notice that. There's no shame about this. This is a patriotic American movement. America first, one God. This comes to the surface again and again. In the 1950s we see it, in the 1960s in connection with civil rights. There it is again. And it persists into the modern period in very public ways. Bob Jones University was famously a Christian segregated university. Bob Jones made history in 2001 when it issued a public apology for its racist past. We all thought, well, that's it, man. That is it. Put that chapter to bed. If Bob Jones University says, I'm sorry for being a racist all those years, then we're done with that. But then something else happened. Quite surprising. A number of things happened, in fact. The election of Barack Obama. Huge, huge surprise. America's first president who wasn't a white man is black. A black president. What does that mean for America's caste system? And then Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri. George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And the Black Lives Matter movement exploded across the country. If Barack Obama was a more gentlemanly version of the new racial regime in America, the end of the caste system, The Black Lives Matter movement was the militant version of it. And then this happened, right? GLB added a T. That's a big T. Trans is huge for people because it challenges the fundamental structure that is only implicit in the other alphabet. Gay, lesbian, bi. Okay, two men can have sex, but they're both men. Two women can have sex, but they're both women. What if there are people who say, I'm not a man, I'm not a woman, or I was a man, but I'm really a woman, or I was a woman, but I'm really a man? Then the whole idea of gender is called into question, and that's a fundamental human structure. So America's caste system is publicly exposed and exploded, and then militantly so, and then the whole gender regime comes apart. Oh, and then what happens? In the middle of all that, the pandemic and the measures that the federal government has to take to control the pandemic, I think these are all huge, huge irritations to America's conservative religious base. They're all about conforming to a divinely ordered structure. And that conformity is voluntary. It comes from us. It comes from inside. It comes from our moral core. It doesn't come from the United States government. They imposed their morality on us in the 19th century, in the Civil War, and we're still nursing that wound. It's true. It's true. The idea of the lost cause, still out there. Still out there. Yeah. And so, surprise, surprise, that mix of authoritarianism and religion and submission, this is the thing that puzzles most people, many people anyway, about the Trump phenomenon. How people fall in line behind Trump and say whatever he says is true. I don't care what he says, it's true. And this is freedom. All under the banner of freedom. How can that be? Well, you know how that can be. Because submission feels like freedom when you're part of a structure that includes someone below you on the pecking order. And so that's a big part of this, isn't it? And so race comes back into play, but added to that is the scapegoating of immigrants. Yeah. So this phenomenon we see, where people gather, ecstatic, wild events, celebratory events, acts of submission, repentance, prayer, and the elevation of a powerful man to a kind of divine status. Yeah, I wish it were funny, huh? I wish it were funny. This is not coming from nowhere, though. This comes from America's DNA, America's religious DNA. It's all right there. The idea that we are a chosen people, that we live in a fallen world, that when you realize that, it's a tremendous release. It's an emotional experience. Get your act together. Submit to the new regime. Conform and reform the society to be more in line with the Christ-like vision you have. And you make America great again. I think that America's religious DNA has to be accounted for if we're going to understand what's happening among us. And if you don't agree with what's happening among us, you need to understand it very well so you can make your case against it. So my role here today is to kind of explain it from my point of view, from a historian of religion's point of view. I think we're at a time now to break. We're about at the end of the hour, and I want to remind you that you've got an index card, and so take your index card, and if you have a comment or a question or an insight you would like to make part of our conversation this afternoon in the second hour, please write it down, and let's put those cards, let's collect them right on top of this machine here, okay? Put them right there where I'll see them, and I'll grab them at some point and quick read through them and see what themes and questions are there, okay? Hopefully we'll get everybody's voice in the conversation one way or another. So we are now having a little break for how long? For 10 minutes. So get up and stretch and get yourself going, yeah. So I'm going to, okay. I'm going to try to do a few questions that are pertinent to the lecture itself. and I can see there are other things here as well, like, how do we stop Trump? And I'm pretty sure I don't have the answer to that. Someone asked me if I was married to the Senator, Deb Patterson, and it's true I am. And we'll be calling on you in a few years to knock on doors. But she might have answers along those lines, but I don't. I really don't know what to do about any of that. My role is as an historian and as someone who knows a little bit about religion, and so I'm just trying to bring that bit of light to the conversation so we know about that. Okay, we all set here? Okay, good. Was Lincoln's second inaugural address intentionally written to address the split in the religious aspect of the war? Certainly, absolutely. It is a theological treatise. It is a tiny little theological treatise, but it is a theological interpretation of the war, and it's designed to take those two differing theological interpretations and try to bring them back together. It was not successful, of course. But one thing I would add just about Lincoln's second inaugural, this idea that the war is a kind of atonement for all of America, for the sins of slavery. That is not something he invented. That was a very common theme in Northern preaching about the war during the period of the war itself. So he did a little research or his speechwriter did and found that. If many Americans did not own slaves or black sharecroppers, wasn't it the benefit of suppressing blacks and others to assure one's relative worth? Yeah, this is the point I was trying to make, that it wasn't just wealthy planters or factory owners in the South who benefited from slavery. I think all Americans did and do continue, that is, white Americans, or Americans that are classified as white in the caste system, I think all benefit from slavery insofar as it enables us to have a kind of strongly hierarchical and which we say capitalist society in which there are lots of losers, frankly. It allows us to have that and still have a kind of rhetoric, at least, or a framework of freedom, to say we are free. And this has led to a lot of debates in America about what freedom really is. Is it freedom from, or is it freedom to? Well, it's clearly both. It's freedom from and freedom to. But if you don't have agency, you're going to have a very limited experience of freedom. But if you live in a caste system where your skin gives you a psychological advantage and a physical advantage and an economic advantage, then you can your freedom experience is greatly enhanced. And this is Isabel Wilkerson's thesis, of course, in caste. It's also Ta-Nehisi Coates has said this about the role of the American black-white caste system in bolstering white self-esteem, if you will. So this has been a part of our, well, since 1619, this has been part of our cultural weave, I guess, if you would say, for 4 centuries now. And it's really hard for North Americans to turn away from that. And what we're seeing now is certainly, insofar as the right-wing movement is also a race-based movement, a racist movement, we're seeing a resurgence of that caste system, a defense of that caste system. Although, I have to say, whenever Trump is photographed today in a group, whenever there are people clustered around him, he always is very clear. He's very sure to have one or two African Americans, and usually somebody who looks kind of his brown skin, maybe Hispanic, right there in the picture. They're always there. So there's. Okay, let's see here. Let me look for another one that has to do with. Here's another one. What can we do? I don't know. What accounts? This is very broad. Let me see. The Constitution is losing its authority. I don't know anything about that. What can non-submissive people do to wake up Trumpers? I don't know. The close world, something about world events can be framed as the rapture. Let's talk about millenarian thinking. I'll latch onto that piece of the question, right? American Calvinism has always been millenarian, that is, looking to the second coming. And I think that people who are not in that discourse, that world, don't understand how powerful that idea is still in our culture. There are several people with major responsibilities in federal government as of the last 2 weeks who hold to those views. Most Christian nationalists also have that as part of their view. That is, the United States must become a Christian nation in preparation for the return of Jesus to consummate the millennium, to begin the 1,000-year rule of Christ. Many people have distinct views, definite views about Middle Eastern politics and what happens in Israel connected to their millenarian thinking, their apocalyptic thinking. One very common idea is that the Jewish people have to reclaim all of the land that was part of the original kingdom of David in order for the Messiah to return. So these folks are very pro-Israel and very encouraging of Israel to retake all of the land, to reclaim all the land, for example, that's been allocated to Palestinians and reconstitute the kingdom of David so that Christ can return and they can all become Christians. Kind of a backhanded compliment there. I mean, it's, we're sort of backing into. So that way of thinking plays a very, very important role in a lot of evangelical thinking and a lot of Christian nationalist thinking and in the thinking of people in places of authority in our government right now. So this is something we have to be aware of, and sometimes just articulating it is a way of countering it. Just naming it and saying, okay, this is what you believe, defend it. Tell me what you really think. All right. So there's here are some good questions about the deficiencies of my lecture. This is what about Catholics and Jews? What about Quakers? And what about the American nations and relation to American cultural areas and development? I'm not sure what this is too sketchy. This one is relation to American nations, Woodard, cultural areas of development. That's too sketchy for me to understand what it is. If that's somebody's question, I will give it back to you. You can fill it out for me. Okay, so a lot of America's religious history isn't mentioned. It wasn't mentioned. Why? You only gave me an hour, so give me 10, and we'll get it all. So Catholics. Catholics began to immigrate into this country in large numbers during the same years as the Great Awakening is going on. But these are immigrants. They're poor, mostly poor immigrants, and all they can do is just struggle to keep their heads above water. They are not moving the nation one way or another. They are, though, forming enclaves and neighborhoods. And some of the interaction between these emerging mainstream Protestants and Catholics do shape the debate around, say, school prayer and the use of the Bible in schools. One of the big reform movements among the Protestants was to create Horace Mann's school system with McGuffey readers that were all filled with biblical themes, and originally actually biblical passages. So people learned to read in this country for 60, 70, 80 years, reading the Bible, or a sort of a simplified version of the Bible. And when Catholics came into this country in large numbers, said, "Well, we're not sending our kids to those schools because that's not what we believe." And so, in order to integrate Catholics into public schools, the public schools had to take a much more non-Protestant stance. As Stephen Green, who teaches in our law school, if you've ever had a chance to listen to Steve talk or read any number of his many books. He is a really leading scholar on this question of church and state, and we're very fortunate to have him in our midst. So Catholics are part of this story, but they're not part of the story that I'm telling. That is this idea that America is a chosen nation. See, Catholics did not buy into that right away. America and America's going to hell in a handbasket because people are too sinful, and they didn't. That was not part of the Catholic way of thinking, and this is a distinctly Protestant way of thinking. In submission to authority, yes, you have that in Roman Catholicism, but it's because that community was so segregated off from mainstream society in America for through the 19th century. It never became part of the American mainstream. Now, one thing about about Roman Catholicism now, my friend Charles Boberts, who taught at St. John's in the theology school there for about 30 years, tells me that the thing that he's seen in Catholicism now is an evangelicalization of Catholic theology. And there are prominent theologians in the Catholic Church now, mostly lay theologians, interestingly enough, who are offering a kind of evangelical version of Catholicism. It's very conservative, but it has these same themes of conformity and submission to authority. And so American Catholicism is becoming more like American evangelicalism, and at the same time that it's growing more distant from the Pope and the global Catholic movement. The current Pope has huge problems with American right-wing Christian nationalism. Yeah. So, but a lot of American Catholics don't. They're moving in that direction. What about the Quakers? Well, let's not forget the Quakers. They were important as they were the early advocates of abolitionism and formed the front wave, brave opposition to slavery when most Americans were not opposed to it. And even through the Great Awakening, up until the years just before the Civil War, most American Protestants were not abolitionists, not stridently so. They were mildly so, but they were not in favor of the kinds of things that the Grimke sisters, for example, were advocating. And so the Quakers and the and other Peace Church antecedents, the Mennonites, for example. Who am I not thinking of here? Pardon? The Unitarians, thank you. No, the Unitarians, yeah. They were all on the front wave of abolitionism, while everybody else was saying, well, it's not a good thing, slavery, but it'll go away naturally if we just wait. And they were saying, no, it won't. And they convinced more and more people, but what finally happened was those evangelical denominations that we talked about earlier, they caught the abolitionist bug, and when they said, this cannot stand, then the country went to war. It's in history of American religion circles, it's often said that the splitting of these Protestant churches before the war was the harbinger of war. That was the first shot of the Civil War, and I think that's really true. That's really true. So sorry not to be able to. And Jews in America, again, an important part of American religious history, but when you're asking, where does this, Christian nationalism come from? That's entirely an irrelevant point. So, what Jews contribute to American culture is much, much different, religiously speaking. Yeah, that would get me into, I like this question. Is there a way that, are there markers that can predict which way a person will turn, toward freedom from or toward freedom to? In other words, can we predict who will submit to conformism and who will be a skeptic? I don't know. But here's one thing. I kind of wanted to make a point here. And the way I framed the freedom question, and I was framing it for students this way too at the beginning of the semester, and I was quite wrong. That in the philosophical discussion of freedom, there's freedom is both freedom from, freedom to, and then there are people who say, well, it's really freedom from, and these tend to be libertarians, by the way, who say as long as there are no restraints, then you're good, But others say, no, it's really freedom too. It's about agency. So if you don't have the wherewithal to be free, then you're not really free. And so these are people who favor more, say, the welfare state or something like that, or government support of human effort. So, but I think the most thoughtful people on freedom are saying, no, every act of freedom is simultaneously an experience of freedom from and freedom to, both. Yeah, it's not either or. It's both, and I think that's true. I think that's very true. And so the question, well, certainly. You came here today as a free act, right? And you decide you had nothing else to do, so you were free from your schedule, and you had a car or a ride, so you had freedom too, and so you got here, and there you are. It's all together one thing. Yeah. Now the thing is, I think the thing to realize about freedom is that freedom too does pose the most difficulties, right? You may not have had anything on your schedule today, but you did have to get up and get dressed and have some breakfast and call your friend or whatever to get over here and go out in the cold weather. I guess it's not so bad anymore. At any point along the way, you might easily have gone back to bed, right? And I think that is a big thing to realize about freedom, is that it's not all it's cracked up to be. And when you encounter difficulties in the Freedom 2 side, a lot of people look for a way to reframe things. And my guru on this is an old psychology theorist named Erich Fromm, who was trying to just figure this all out. You know this, yeah, okay. The book Flight from Freedom, very important book in my pardon? Well, it depends. If you buy it in America, it's Flight from Freedom. If you buy it in Britain, it's Escape from Freedom, or vice versa. It's a weird book. It has two different titles, depending on where it was published. See, I know from this book. And he's trying to figure out what happened in Nazi Germany. And it's basically, he says, when people experience freedom for the first time, they get cold feet. And a way to experience freedom is to get into a hierarchy. And when you're in a hierarchy, you got somebody telling you what to do, so that takes the heat off in terms of responsibility. But if you're in a hierarchy, you can also punch down on whoever's below you, and that gives you a feeling of power, which is a good substitute for freedom. Are any of you part of an organization that is not hierarchically oriented or hierarchically organized? Try to think of one. It's hard. It's hard. I've lived my life in universities and educational institutions. We're just as hierarchical as everybody else. Tenured professors are kind of in a unique place because you have people in authority over you, but you don't have to listen to them, which is highly frustrating to them. But we all live our lives in hierarchical organizations like this. And so I don't want to suggest that this is a special illness of Nazis or of conservatives. It is part of being human. You know, before we walked out of the forest, we were living in little tribes or clans, and lined up behind the most powerful person in the group who could protect us all from the other clan's powerful person. And that made us feel safe. And so there's something that feels good to human beings about hierarchy. And knowing your place, knowing your role, getting up in the morning and knowing what's expected of you. Nothing more disturbing than anomie. And I think that is what happened to people out on the frontier in the first half of the 19th century. I think they experienced a lot of anomie. I think they experienced a lot of, what am I going to do with my time today? I tried clearing forests yesterday, and it was too hard. What am I going to do now? And or maybe they get burned out, or maybe like my great-great-great-great-grandfather, you show up and somebody else has got your land, and he's got a big gun or a big axe, or I don't know, can just beat you over the head with his bare hands. What do? You know, you long for the police force to come in and help you out, and there's nobody there. And so the phenomenon of the Great Awakening was a kind of response to that. Here was a somewhat organized, chaotic event, or a demonstration of how chaos can be tamed by submission. And you can pass through this cathartic experience of spiritual ecstasy and come out on the other side ready to submit. And feeling good about it, feeling like I've been saved. And that's the language, isn't it? I've been saved. It feels safe. So If this comes up again and again for us in our culture, we should not be surprised. It's part of being human. One more, there was a question here, I can't find it now, about Christianity itself. And Christianity itself, you must remember, is a hierarchical, authoritarian system, if you will, a way of thinking, right? We don't think of it that way because we experience it in the United States, where freedom of religion tells us that we're all free. But for 14 centuries, Christianity worked hand in glove with secular authorities to create a system of a very hierarchical, authoritarian system, ruled over by a single person with absolute power, the king, right? And standing beside him was the Pope, who had, at least symbolically, even more absolute power. Power to condemn you to eternal damnation, if you wanted. And that was Christianity. And Christian theologians lay this out very clearly. You read Augustine, this is his theology. Human beings are a mess. And so we need a strong, a strong civic government to keep us in line until either we die or the second coming arrives. So that's Christianity, and it's Western civilization for, what did I say, Augustine through the French Revolution, 14, 15 centuries. It's a long time. So we're still Christian. If Christianity is still a religion in Western civilization, and occasionally it pairs up with people who are frightened of their freedom to create a kind of new authoritarian system with a strong religious bent, this should not surprise us. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our religious DNA. Is that a tired metaphor? Should I drop that? What do you think? The DNA thing. I don't know. I kind of like it, but it makes me sound more scientific. But anyway, you think it works? Oh, no. When does Creflo Dollar take his rightful place in our Christian nation? That's an interesting. Creflo Dollar is a black evangelist, very prominent preacher, has his own big mega church, and preaches a kind of something we call the prosperity gospel. And this is a kind of extreme form of Calvinism that says, if you submit, then God will reward you with material wealth. And this is a big part of a modern American evangelical Christianity. And there are white church versions of it and black church versions of it. Another part of this history that I didn't cover because I just didn't know how to do it in a timely manner and in a relevant manner is the fact that in the same period, the first half of the 19th century, all of the denominations we're talking about, well, mostly the Methodists and the Baptists, but the other denominations too in their own way, all of them had black members in limited numbers, and they all split off from the main church during this period and formed the black churches. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, African American Episcopal Church, Zion, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, a lot of Methodist breakoffs. And the Presbyterians and the Congregationals also had their breakoff groups. So blacks formed their own congregations because of the experience of racism they encountered within the white denominations where they hoped to be able to worship as equals. Those churches formed the basis of a black subculture that had the same theology that functioned very differently. The same idea. You're all sinners. And that's the problem. If you straighten up and fly right and live a moral life, then things will work out for you. And the idea of powerful God and the chosen people is there as well, but flipped on its head. That is, we're the chosen people, not our oppressors, and that powerful God will rescue us. And when the second coming comes, when the Lord returns, he will destroy slavery, he will destroy this whole culture of enslavement, and we'll all enjoy a just society. So it's the same theology, but when it's embedded in a population so severely oppressed as Africans were in pre-Civil War time, and of course after as well, it works very, very differently. In the black church still functions this way, but there's another thing about the black church that I had a lot of students at Eden Seminary who were black church tradition, and I was kind of a liberation theologian, and kind of trying to bring them along in that liberation theology tradition of seeing the gospel finally in terms of human liberation. And they told me, they schooled me on the black church, saying, look, it's not ideal. The black church is just as hierarchical as the white church. And there is a class division within the black churches between those who are prosperous and prospering and those who are not, who are, and you see the latter would be storefront churches where you have very poor people gathering, but there are also black megachurches where the prosperous and prospering black population gathers in a similar kind of celebration of black culture, but it's not really liberation theology in the same way you might encounter it in Latin America. And Creflo Dollar, this was also a big roundabout to Creflo Dollar and the Black Prosperity Gospels. It's a black version of that has a white version. There's a white prosperity gospel version and a black prosperity gospel version, and it just works differently if you're preaching it to middle class and upper middle class white people, and and on the other hand you're preaching it to a congregation of black people who, on average, studies tell us have roughly 1/10 of the accumulated capital of white people in this country. So it just works very, very differently, and so you see elements of this Calvinist American Calvinism in black churches, but it just works a lot differently, even though the language often sounds the same. They use the same language, the same kind of discourse, but it just works a lot differently. Do I have hope? Can we break through the Trump mindset? Can we wake them up? Can we save the Constitution? Is Trump the Antichrist? Don't ask Senator Patterson that question, by the way. What accounts for so many different religious denominations? That's a good question. Another thing I didn't say anything about that is really endemic to American religion is it is a very, very splintered Christian landscape. There are dozens and dozens of denominations, and this also goes back to the Second Great Awakening and that formative period when these various Protestant denominations were coming to life, and it really has to do with the different ways in which they each imagined the ideal society. That's a big, big part of it. Another big part of it, I mean, the biggest split in American Protestant religion was the split north and south caused by the Civil War. But that split was also kind of fueled by and accompanied by a difference that developed on the Bible. Prior to the Civil War, all these groups were very biblically based. But after the Civil War, that's different. In the North, those progressive churches have a different view of the Bible than in the South, and so that idea, that question, where do you stand on the Bible? That also is a big divider and contributed to a lot of denominational splitting. Is anybody here a disciple? Christian Church Disciples of Christ? Well, this is an interesting group because when you hear disciples of Christ, don't you think, gosh, that's a strange sounding group? Doesn't it sound like a little sectarian group of some sort? Right? But this is one of the most, they were among the original Great Awakening churches. The disciples were, maybe they even were. And yet today they've shrunk to the point where people don't know of them anymore, and so they sound kind of quirky. But they split, that denomination split into the Disciples of Christ on the one hand and the Church of Christ on the other hand, and over the issue of the Bible. How would they read the Bible critically, Disciples of Christ, or would they read it so-called literally? And Church of Christ. And today, the Church of Christ is one of the largest evangelical denominations, with churches all over the country, a very large denomination. And their parent group, the Disciples of Christ, is a very small denomination, culturally relatively insignificant. Unfortunately, I mean, I love the disciples. My father was a disciples pastor. My grandfather was, and was raised in that tradition. But this is, the story of American Christianity: split, more splits, and never a coming together. Not never. The United Church of Christ is a coming together of various denominations, some German, some English, but. One reason these churches are struggling is they've never been able to mount a significant ecumenical movement to draw them together to be a significant cultural force again. So that's kind of our problem. If you're speaking as a church person, by the way, that's our problem. It's not your problem. Maybe you don't care about that. They should all go away anyway, as far as you're concerned. But they're not going away. What do we got on time? We're done? Oh, well, I am very, very, I'm so sorry that I didn't get through more of these, but I will take them, and I will read them, and adjust accordingly.
I hear often the question, like, how did we get here? Thank you for filling in some of that history, and thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.